welcome to another episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. I'm your hostess, Caitlin, with 20 plus years experience within living history and 12 plus years with experience within living history as a hobby and somewhat as a profession. If you're new here, hi, welcome. So glad to have you here. And if you're a returning viewer, thank you so much for coming back. This podcast explores things like myth debunking, historical wardrobes, a lot of things within the 19th and 20th centuries in terms of research, and also a little bit about how I have incorporated things that I have learned from history into my everyday 21st century life. So if that sounds interesting to you, I would love it if you consider subscribing and following along. Last time we discussed some quintessential mistakes that I see female living historians especially make when they first get started. And this week we're going to do part 2 to the 19th century advice to married women. This is going to be the 1860 to 1880 version. We did, I think, 1830 to 1860 last time. So without any further ado, let's get started. All the resources I'm using, which there's only about 3 or 4 for this particular episode, are free online for Google Books. If you search the author name and the title of the book, it should pop right up for you and you can read any of them thoroughly if you prefer that. So let's begin in 1863, right smack dab in the middle of the American Civil War. This is a British publication entitled Uncle David's Advice to Young Men and Young Women on the Subject of Marriage. On the title page, we get a cute little illustration of father reading aloud what is likely a Bible given how big it is, a mother, 2 children, an infant, and a really cranky looking grandma over there. Like, she does not look like she's doing well. The first pages of the book read, quote, "If the reader be not already engaged, it may be to his advantage to attend the counsels of one who has seen much married life among the classes, who has observed much of happiness but more of misery in the married state. I decidedly approve of matrimony, and therefore I have no intention to dissuade you from it. It is not good for man to be alone, are the words of God himself. Whoso findeth a wife, that is, one who deserves the name, findeth a good thing. The bliss of paradise was not complete until woman was given to be a helpmeet for man. Surely it is a good thing for man to have a comfortable, independent home of his own, where ease and rest can be enjoyed after the toils of the day, where sorrow and care can be chased away by the smiles and soothing caresses of a loving and devoted wife." End quote. This is technically part of his advice to young men, which I said last time I wouldn't get into because we're talking about, advice technically to women because we focus on women in this podcast. But I did want to leave with that quote. And there's also, I'm going to have Rhett read this next one because I read it out loud to him and he thought it'd be hilarious if he dressed up and read this. And I agree. So here's my husband.
In an old book on cookery, the directions for dressing a hare are preceded by this discreet advice. First, catch your hare. But the hare when caught may not, after all, be worth the cooking. There is not, however, so much difference in hares as in women. If every hare is not worth the cooking, so neither is every woman worth the courting and the marriage fee.
Don't worry, Uncle David's advice does get a little bit better than that. After a few case studies of men who choose poor wives and lead themselves to quarrelsome marriages and early deaths, we get a paragraph on love. Quote, "The only sure foundation of all true happiness in the married life is love. Love formed in the fear of God. But what is love? It is what most young people are often talking about, but which few understand. Love is not the dream of passion, the product of fancy, such as you generally read of in modern romances and novels. It is something much purer and more noble. To it, passion is but a secondary matter. It respects the mind as well as the body. Attachment arising merely from the outside attractions is not really love. It regards only in the least part of the person. It is confined to the quality which is only skin deep, which is proverbial fatality, which disease and accident may destroy any hour, and which is often found to resemble fruit whose surfaces display a beautiful bloom but is often rotten at the core and is thrown away in disgust as soon as it is opened. Love on which marriage is based is love to a whole person, love to the mind, the heart, the manners, as well as the countenance and form, love tempered with respect, for this is the only attachment likely to last, to live beyond the charm of novelty, the spoliation of disease and the ravages of time, or which will ever render marriage what it was designed to be, a source of mutual help and comfort." End quote. In the section specifically to women, the book reads, quote, "Marriage was doubtless designed to promote human felicity, not less for the woman than the man. Nor does this earth contain a scene where richer enjoyment than is presented by the marriage union when based on right principles and regulated by suitable dispositions. When it fails to yield enjoyment, it becomes a source of disappointment and misery. Be assured that the cause originates with the parties themselves, and in most cases can be traced back to the errors and indiscretions that marked the formation of their union. Now it is to some of the errors that that occasion unhappy marriages that I wish to direct the attention of the young women who may favor me with their attention. If, therefore, you'll take a seat around me, as an Indian would say, lend me your ears for a short time, I will try to impart a little wisdom I have acquired by a long course of observation." End quote. Uncle David is a self-described 70-year-old man who loves good humor and imparting wisdom to younger generations. He then gives young women advice on having discretion when choosing a husband. Quote, "It is for this very reason that caution is so necessary, and that you ought to look well before you leap. It is obvious that no decision of your whole earthly existence requires the exercise of calm judgment more than this. Yet observation shows that how rarely the judgment is allowed to give counsel, and how generally the passions and appetites settle the business. While seated lately in one of the arcades of London, for I visit various places in order to increase my knowledge of men and things, my attention became directed to a party of females who were engaged in the difficult task of selecting and purchasing some headdresses. A great variety of every shape and color were placed before them. All were viewed, examined in the most minute and deliberate manner. The form, color, style, decorations were keenly criticized. First one, then another was tried on, looked at before the glass, compared, then tried on again, examined left and right, before and behind. A general consultation followed. After long deliberation, many arguments, pro and con, and when it seemed as there was nothing more else that could be said, and the patience of the poor saleswoman was all but exhausted, the decision so weighty and important was arrived at and the purchases made. You smile, young women, but it makes me serious when I think how many females marry with less consideration than they display when they purchase a dress, bonnet, or cap. Yet these are things which, if you do not like them after you have worn them or tried them on for a time, you may sell or give away or cast aside, whereas marriage is a life matter. When you marry, you take your husband, for better for worse, till death do us part. Of course, every young woman who is thinking of entering the marriage state believes, or tries to believe, that she is going to acquire a good husband. Is it not so with you? But marriage is a lottery, in which there are many blanks as well as prizes, and, as many think, far more of the former than the latter, and the probability of your attaining a prize will be small indeed. But you ask, how are we to distinguish the good from the bad? Men are often very deceitful, carry a wicked heart underneath a fair and elusive outside. Yet we cannot treat them as we would a peach or an apple. We cannot cut them in two to see whether the fine bloom on the skin is connected with the soundness of the heart. Certainly not. When a young man generally spends his evenings at the public house, or wastes the early part of the week in idleness and pleasure-taking, you may almost be sure that he will attract but little value to home comforts or to a wife's society. When you discover another fondness for rough and dissipated companions, and a proneness to use rude and profane language, you need not hesitate, write him down as a man of vulgar mind and of gross passions. As you value your peace and welfare, from all such turn away." End quote. Uncle David then goes on to describe where you should not meet a husband. You should not meet your husband at a fair, in a wake, the revel, the theater, or the casino. Matches made in such places will only bring forth sin and misery. Instead, young women wishing to be married ought to prepare themselves to be the type of woman a good man would be attracted to, and make sure that they are ready to be a wife and to care for a household. Quote, "Let me then entreat every young woman honestly to ask herself the question whether she is qualified and prepared to fulfill a wife's duties and to satisfy a husband's reasonable claims. Nay, do not pout and look impatient. Remember that you have not merely to think about how you are to gain a good husband, but how you may spend life together so as to attain the largest amount of happiness in a state where at best trials and difficulties are unavoidable. Have you been domestically trained? In plainer language, have you been taught well to clean, to wash and bake, to knit and sew, to mend a stocking, to repair a shirt? Do you know how to keep a house clean, neat and orderly? When provisions are bought, can you prepare and cook them to advantage? Do you understand home comforts, such as all domesticated men desire and highly prize?" End quote. Uncle David then ends his book with another case study, and that's it. So next we have Physical Life of Man and Woman and Advice to Both Sexes by Dr. P. Henry Chavez, MD, which is less about marriage and more about general advice, but we will touch on it because he does have sections on love and marriage. We actually looked at Dr. Chavez's work in previous podcasts, and we explored the bad habits, aka masturbation, green sickness, and hysteria. His thoughts in that previous work are actually verbatim, basically put in this work as well. So we're going to skip those. Those don't really have to do with marriage. But on the age of which one should marry, he says, quote, "In our own land, the laws differ in different states, ranging from the period of nubility between 18 to 20 for maidens and 21 to 25 for men. This is as it should be. and is in full accord with our knowledge of the vigor and constitution of that period, for there is no drain greater on the physical system than that is caused by the act of generation. There is nothing, moreover, which hastens to the same degree a premature decay as its premature indulgence." End quote. The act of generation, yes, is marital relations. The act of generation, you're generating life. The author suggests that a good period of engagement should be from 6 months to a year, which, yeah, I agree. I actually think a year engagement is a little bit long. I think it should be less than 6 months ideally, but no more than 9 months. But I could see people wanting to wait a year. Then we get a whole section on the time of year and month to marry. It doesn't matter for men apparently, but it does for women according to the doctor. So choose the time of the month where you won't be on your period, so you don't have to deal with that when you consummate the marriage. He actually says specifically pick the time in between your two periods, well, we would know you were ovulating then, but he doesn't know that. They think that you ovulate right before your period. So his thought process is you don't have to worry about conceiving a child right, when you're consummating your marriage. You'll have a little bit before you had to think about that, which we know isn't the case, but that is what they thought back then. As for the time of year, the doctor says you need to make note that in 9 months to a year, you'll probably be giving birth, and you don't want to give birth in the summer because of how difficult pregnancy can be in the heat. And also, apparently, and the doctor does not list the sources for this, which I would be interested to seeing, but apparently there's a higher rate of infant mortality in the summer months than there are in the winter months, which I would actually think it'd be the opposite. You would think in the cold weather that you would lose more children, but I would be very interested in seeing sources on this. So in summary, get married in early spring. Then there's the whole next paragraph, which I'm just going to quote because there's no reason to have commentary on this. But we are discussing advice to married women, and marital relations are a part of that. So, quote, "At what time of the day should intercourse occur? It is a question that may be here appropriately discussed. All writers agree that sexual congress should not be performed immediately after meals. All the surplus blood in the body is required then for the purpose of digestion. The excitement of the genital act extracts it and consequently interferes with that most important function. Authors differ, however, to the period of evening when the drain will be less experienced. The laboring man returns to his home in a state of physical exhaustion. Certainly it would be better if he wait for a time for recovery. This recovery is generally secured, however, between the time of his return and retirement, and there are many arguments in favor of the selection of the evening. In the first place, it cannot be doubted that nature has intended the act but as a prelude to conception. Conception is much more easily effected in the evening because of the position that is maintained for the night. And then there is a long rest of the whole night for recovery. There are exceptional cases, however, where the impulse at other times is imperative, then should nature be obeyed. For in this, as in everything, she is the best guide, infallible, and when only her dictates are submitted to, when the artificial stimulus of passion was not substituted in her place, indulged only at these times when the physical system is in its greatest strength, the product of the resulting conception receives the most favorable conditions for both mental and physical vigor." End quote. So now let's discuss should relations marry. Now there are my opinions and there's also the doctor's opinions. So siblings should not marry, which I absolutely agree with. But cousins may marry according to him as long as there's no known family illnesses. So there is that. Then we get a whole several pages on the evils of polygamy. I didn't actually look into that very much because we're talking about advice to marriage, but that would be an interesting thing to read. The next section is actually should people of different races marry? And I was actually very surprised to learn that Dr. Chavez is pro interracial marriage. His main reason, though, is that interracial couples produce some of those beautiful children. He also does suggest it is a good idea to mix blood for health reasons. Quote, "The efficacy of the cross of temperament and disposition is exemplified, as stated in those lands where different races were intermingled. They are always of vigorous intellect and physique. Royalty in Europe today is a sad instance of the converse. Royalty has exhausted its stock. The farmer knows full well that it is utterly impossible to grow the best grain by planting the same seed year after year in the same soil. And when he sows wheat one year and plants corn the other, and tobacco the next still, he but weds to the great womb of the earth stock a different nature." End quote. Honestly, I was actually very surprised to see this in a 19th century book. Now, as to the wedding itself, Dr. Chavez stresses the matter of personal taste and should be left entirely to the bride. Directly after the wedding, it should be a period of rest. The doctor dislikes extended honeymoons that are traveling honeymoons, as a tiring nature of travel and the expenditure of money that could be best used elsewhere. Quote, but the bride should certainly be spared the criticism which she is subjected on the next morning at the hands of his or her unfeeling or curious relatives and friends. The very best method is to enter the future home at once and there remain secluded until their mutual affection has been so far satisfied as to permit them to appear in public without exciting comment or criticism. End quote. The next section is on moderation or having self-control with sexual desires, even in marriage. Quote, at no time in the whole history of the lives of the married pair is there such a danger of excess sexual indulgence as just after marriage. Unbridled license is often given to the passions, and not infrequently the most serious consequences ensue. The glutton, after repletion, often loathes its presence. While love is more than a mere passion, it is nevertheless strongly dependent on it. And love, like hunger, is experienced at greater force when the appetite is retained. End quote. The next section is on, can you influence having a boy or a girl? And honestly, I wasn't exactly expecting this in this work, so we're really not going to talk about that. That'll be for the fertility video, which will be the next one in the series. Then we get a whole section on intersex people, which have both male and female genitalia, and nothing much is said except, hey, these people exist, and here are some examples of these people and what they went through, which is interesting. Then we get more information on marital relations. It's okay during pregnancy, abstain for a few months after birth, but it's okay to do while the woman is nursing, etc. The following section is on divorce, or where further union is a curse. And finally, we get advice to the wife specifically. Quote, my theme then is health. The health of the wives and the object that I should constantly have in view will only be the best means of preserving it and restoring it when it is lost. By making the wife strong, she will not only in the majority of cases be made fruitful, but capable of bringing healthy children into the world. This latter inducement is of greatest importance, for puny children are not only an anxiety to their parents, but a misery to themselves and a trouble all around. Besides, it is the children of America that are to be her future men and women, her glory and her greatness. How desirable it is, then, that her children should be sturdy and strong. End quote. Be in good health, don't be idle, don't be a slave to fashion, etc. Quote, a fashionable lady might say, I cannot give up my fashionable amusements, I must enjoy myself as others do. I might as well be out of the world as out of the fashion. To such a one I reply, I myself am not a fashionist. It is not in my line. And as the following pages I have to tell some plain, unvarnished truths. My advice to you, close this book at once and read no more of it, as such a work as this cannot be of the slightest use to you. However, it might be to one who values health as a jewel of great price, as one of her most precious earthly possessions. Fashion is sometimes another name but for suicide and for baby slaughter. For massacre of the innocents, God help the poor unfortunate child whose mother is a voluntary of fashion, who spends her time in a round and whirl of fashionable life, and leaves her child to the tender mercies of servants. End quote. So the next section is basically in summary, wives should exercise regularly and keep themselves healthy, bathe regularly and keep herself clean. She should eat well, not skip breakfast, but she should eat lots of milk and butter. Wives may drink wine or sherry with dinner, or ale if wine doesn't agree with them, but should only take brandy medicinally. And then there's a whole section on ventilations of rooms and early rising and that sort of thing, just like typical habits. The mid-19th century was huge in ventilation. I don't know, I think it was just like a new thing that they just kind of figured out. Ventilating rooms is healthy, gets fresh air in. So the 1860s is all about the room ventilation. The doctor then goes on to caution the wife on dress. Quote, let me strongly caution the newly wedded wife against the evil effects of tight lacing. The waist ought, as a rule, to be from 27 to 29 inches in circumference. If, therefore, she bind and gird herself until she be only 23 inches, and in some cases she be only 21 inches, it must be done at the expense of comfort, of health, and happiness. If stays be worn tightly, they press down on the contents of the lower part of the belly, which might either prevent a lady from having a family, or might produce a miscarriage. Let her dress be loose and be adapted to the season. She ought not to adopt the fashion of wearing in the morning warm clothes with long sleeves, and in the evening thin dresses with short sleeves. It is a hopeless battle with fashion in matters of dress. Women will never believe that their bonnets, neck wrappers, or huge petticoats, until they go out of fashion, can have anything to do with headaches, sore throats, or rheumatism. But they ought to know that the more they swathe themselves, the more tender and delicate they are likely to be. If they wish to withstand cold, they should accustom themselves to bear it. End quote. Our next book we won't spend too long on, but it's by but is by Dr. George Nafis, who we looked at when we did menstruation videos as well. He repeats a lot of Dr. Chavez's thoughts and organizes his thoughts in much the same way and in the same order, right down to it being okay to marry cousins, although Dr. Nafis is vehemently against the marrying between races, which is interesting. So we get two different perspectives there. I kind of like Dr. Chavez's opinions better, but there's that. Dr. Nafis goes further, though, and has a whole section on STDs and infidelity of husbands and even engaged couples and the poor girls that were roped into these illnesses without even understanding what was going on. Like, they didn't have a lot of sexual knowledge, ended up getting diseases through the misconduct of their fiancés or husbands. Quote, a physician in central Pennsylvania lately had this experience. A young lady of unblemished character asked his advice for a troublesome affection of the skin. He examined it and to his horror recognized a form of one of the most loathsome diseases, which curse only the vilest and the most unfortunate of her sex. Yet he could not suspect this girl. On inquiry, he found that she had a small but painful sore on her lip, which she noticed a few days after being at a picnic with a young man. Just as he was bidding her goodnight, he had kissed her on the lips. At once everything was clear. This young man was a patient of the physician. He was a victim of this vile disease, and even his kiss was enough to convey it. We have been consulted by wives, pure, innocent women, for complaints which they themselves and sometimes their children suffered from, the nature of which we dare not tell them, but which pointed the fatal finger to the unfaithfulness of the husband. How utterly was their domestic happiness wrecked when they discovered the cause of the constant ill health. End quote. Dr. Nafis does agree with me that long engagements are evil, though. He also agrees with Dr. Chavez at the time of month a woman should marry directly between her periods. He also agrees with the other doctor on the evils of the wedding tour, aka the honeymoon. Basically, it's just too much to expect a couple to go on a long trip, to be exhausted. They should just go home and relax and spend the time together before taking any travel plans. The next chapter is advice to the wife, starting with the wedding night. Quote, we now enter upon the consideration of the great period of the life of woman. The maiden becomes a wife. She is born into a new world. The great object of the conjugal union is the transmission of life, a duty necessary in order to repair the constant ravages of death, and thus perpetuate the race. In the fulfillment of the sublime obligation, woman plays a more prominent part, as she is the source and depository of the future being. It is of moment, therefore, that she should not be altogether ignorant of the nature and responsibilities of her position. Ignorance here means the suffering, disease, and sometimes death. Let us interrogate science in order to regard these matters among the most interesting of all human concerns. The inclination into marriage is like a full fruition. Maternity is attended with more or less suffering. Much, however, may be done to avert and lessen the pain which awaits upon the first step of this new life. For this purpose, regard must be had to the selection of the day. We have said that a time about midway between monthly recurring periods is best fitted for the consummation of marriage. It is a season of sterility. It recommends itself on this account in the interest of both mother and offspring. The first nuptial relations should be fruitless, in order that the indispositions possibly arising from them shall have time to subside before the appearance of the disturbances indicate to pregnancy. One profound change should not be too quickly succeeded the other. About the 10th day after menstruation should therefore be chosen for the marriage ceremony. It sometimes happens that marriage is consummated with difficulty. To overcome this, care, management, and forbearance should always be employed, and anything like precipitation and violence avoided. Only the consequences of unrestrained impetuosity are to be feared. In those rare cases in which greater resistance is experienced than can be overcome by gentle means, the existence of a condition contrary to nature may be suspected. Violence can then only be productive to injury and is not without danger. Medical art should be appealed to, as it alone can afford assistance in such an emergency. Although the first conjugal approaches are ordinarily accompanied by a slight flooding, a loss of blood does not always occur. Its absence proves nothing. The appearance of blood was formerly regarded as a test of virginity. They were in error. Marital relations ordinarily continue to the first few weeks to be more or less painful. These troubles are increased by the stupid custom of hurrying the bride from place to place at a time where bodily quiet and mental calmness and serenity so desirable to her should be the only objects in view. The old custom of requiring 3 days separation after the first nuptial approach is a wise one, securing to the young wife a soothing and restoration influence of rest. Nothing is lost by it and much is gained. In a little while, however, all irritation should subside, and no suffering or distress of any kind, whether general or local, should be attended by the performance of this important function. The presence of suffering now becomes indicative of disease. Of this we will speak hereafter, end quote. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this in the menstruation videos, but Victorians believed that women were most fertile, as we discussed a little bit before, in the last few days of her cycle, which is actually not when you're fertile. You're fertile in the middle of the cycle, so that was all wrong. I think their thoughts are really nice, that you don't need to stress about getting pregnant. You want to kind of ease into marriage, get used to that, and then become pregnant. I understand all that. I think their thoughts were really good. They just didn't really have the medical background to really understand what was going on. The whole last section was sort of about vaginismus and some women who have a really hard time the first few times. A lot of that is mental. There's actually a few, I didn't even look it up for this particular video, I probably should have. But there was a couple of doctors who noticed women who weren't able to have sexual relations just because it was so painful for them. But when the doctor put them either under hypnosis or in some sort of trance, he was able to put instruments through, and he realized that, oh, this is like a mental thing. This isn't a physical impairment. It's mostly mental, which is usually the case. I think that's still what doctors think today. It's usually psychological, and just something that you need to work through, usually with a therapist and that sort. Of course, they didn't really have therapists back then. I would love to actually know how they dealt with vaginismus and those sorts of diseases. That'd be something to look into. I do like how they mentioned that there's not always blood the first couple times, and that yes, it can be more or less painful for a while, not just the first time. That was really nice to see. There's actually some really good advice in here that I think some women today don't even get. So that's really nice to see from a 19th century book. So next, Dr. Nafis has a section on whether man and wife should sleep in the same room and the same bed. As a general rule, he believes they should, except for when one is contagiously ill, which makes a lot of sense in the 19th century. And it makes a lot of sense now. The only problem with that is generally you're contagious before you start showing symptoms in a lot of illnesses, and so by the time you start noticing one is sick, the other is probably already infected. A few sections later, when we get to should marital relations be suspended. So basically, according to Dr. Nafis, the wife has a right to refuse her husband if he's drunk, etc. And then we get to the fertility section, which Dr. Nafis stresses that there's no such thing, in his opinion, as having too many children. And then there's a section on the crime of abortion. And the book actually states that life begins at conception, which I thought was very interesting. That actually shocked me a little bit, because I'm familiar with the earlier theories in the 19th century, that a baby wasn't considered a life until it started moving, like a woman could actually start feeling it moving within her. That was called the time of quickening. That's still used in this time period. That term quickening is still used. But in earlier centuries, it wasn't necessarily considered a bad thing if a woman had an abortion or ended her pregnancy. As long as it wasn't at that stage of quickening, it wasn't considered necessarily a life yet. There are actually court cases to determine whether a woman, around that 6-month period, whether she had felt it or not, whether she had experienced quickening, and if this was an abortion, like an illegal abortion, meaning the baby was too far along or not. So it's interesting to see that they're now considering life beginning at conception, because that's not a term you see earlier on in most places. There are people who always thought that, but it's not an overarching theme within the early 19th century and even the 18th century, from what I have personally seen. So it's actually very interesting that we're seeing that cultural shift to life begins at conception. This is the 1870s. So I'd like to go back a little bit further and see when exactly that starts. It's just harder to find information on pregnancy and conception when the earlier you get. So later on it becomes a little bit more acceptable to write and publish about it, which is why we're seeing this in the 1870s. But you notice, like, the last time we did this in the 1830 to 1860, we got no sexual information and advice to wives. There was almost nothing. Like, most of those books were written by reverends or pastors, and there was no information. So the fact that we're getting this information now is actually a shift in the social construct and what is considered acceptable to be reading and to be writing and publishing. So it'd be interesting to see if I actually could find information about that. Usually I have to go to court cases that say random neighbor, as on the witness stand going, oh yeah, she told me she could feel the baby move like a week before she lost it, so this was an abortion and it was illegal and she killed her baby. And so I just found that all fascinating. So yeah, I need to go back and see if I can find that theory earlier of life begins at conception, because I was actually not expecting that yet. I never really thought about when that became a thing, like when culturally this became a more normal act to think, So I'm actually quite curious now. I need to go look into that. So the next sections are getting way too much into conception and pregnancy, which is going to be its own video when we talk about fertility and conception and all that. So we'll stop here at Dr. Napi's book. And all the other books I found were just Dr. Chavez's book, published under slightly different names and usually just word for word interpretations. So we're going to end this all here, I suppose. So that'll just about wrap up this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my current research on the second half of the 19th century advice to newly married women. I had a lot of fun researching for this, and I look forward to doing more. So next episode, we'll be looking into dressing the 1860s one, so be on the lookout for that episode in the coming weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me or find me on Instagram or YouTube under the name Caitlin Kearns. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. If you did, please leave a review on Spotify or on YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to tell me what other topics you would like me to cover in future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next one.